Hello, my name is John Phillips, and I am the Assistant Oral Historian at the American Institute of Physics. Welcome to the 5th Virtual Trimble Lecture of 2020 with Nancy Greenspan, entitled Atomic Spy, The Dark Lives of Klaus Fuchs. There are a few things to be aware of before we begin, as shown on the screen. First, all attendees will be in listen-only mode throughout the lectures. To submit questions to the speaker, please use the Q&A function. If you are having technical difficulties, use the chat feature. Finally, closed captions are available for this lecture. To turn them on, click the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. And now, a few remarks from our CEO, Dr. Michael Maloney.
I'm Michael Maloney. I'm the CEO of the American Institute of Physics, and I want to welcome you to this Lyne, Starling, Trimble lecture series. This is part of AIP's focus on researching and understanding the heritage of the physical sciences, and most importantly for this event, promulgating that understanding broadly amongst our own community here at AIP. And frankly, since we've all been working remotely, also working to promulgate understanding of the history of physics broadly amongst the global community. So we really want to welcome you here to AIP. We hope you enjoyed this event, and we hope you will join us again in future AIP events.
Next, a few words from the director of the Center for History of Physics, Dr. Greg Good.
Hi, I'm Greg Good, director of the Center for History of Physics at the American Institute of Physics in College Park, Maryland. Welcome to the 5th webcast presentation in the Trimble Lecture Series for 2020. In this 10th year of Trimble Lectures, our speakers have discussed topics from the science and aesthetics of the Hubble Space Telescope to the story of robotics in Japan and the development of hearing testing from sonar to Muzak. Today's talk takes us into one of the most notorious stories of nuclear espionage in the 20th century, the case of Klaus Fuchs. Today's speaker is Nancy Thorndike Greenspan. Nancy was a health economist and co-author of 4 books with her husband, the late child psychiatrist Stanley Greenspan. She has published 2 scientific biographies, The End of the Certain World, The Life and Science of Max Born in 2005, and in 2020, Atomic Spy, The Dark Lives of Klaus Fuchs. She will be speaking about the latter book today. Nancy has served on the boards of numerous environmental organizations, as well as on committees and boards of the American Institute of Physics and now of the American Institute of Physics Foundation. Welcome, Nancy.
Good evening. It is very nice to be here. Thank you all for coming on and joining us this evening or this afternoon, wherever you may be. I have been involved with the American Institute of Physics for about 25 years as a researcher using the resources here. And I must say it has been a wonderful place to work and do my research on the 2 books, the 2 biographies of physicists that I've written, one of Max Born and now one of Klaus Fuchs. So let me just begin and tell you my story. Hopefully you will enjoy it, and we can have questions at the end. Okay. Klaus Fuchs was a man of mystery and complexity. German by birth, British by naturalization, communist by conviction. As a teenager in the late 1920s, his passion was mathematics, a young scholar who did not espouse political opinions. By 1933, he had transformed into a 21-year-old firebrand whom the Nazi students, leaders, had come to hate and tried to kill. And by 1945, he had aided 3 countries in developing the atomic bomb: the United States, Britain, and the USSR. Many accounts mythologize Fuchs as an isolated, reserved, lonely, frail individual, a characterization that has skewed our image of him. One trait is very valid. His basic nature was always reserved. But this this is not what defined him. What defined Klaus Fuchs was his steely determination for social, political, and economic equality. Fuchs lived in a chaotic time. If he had lived in a different one, he probably would have lived his life as an esteemed professor at a renowned German university, teaching mathematics and being a quiet, reserved, non-political scholar. Instead, in 1950, he became sufficiently infamous that recently a friend asked me, was he evil? So how does one consider a person who risked his life to fight the Nazis and then betrayed his adopted country? Maybe the real question is, how does one weigh the factors in determining moral accountability? Fuchs left little behind about himself. I located a half dozen archives that had been overlooked that filled in gaps. Some files at the University of Kiel were labeled miscellaneous disciplinary matters. They probably hadn't been looked at in 85 years. There was no catalog connection to Fuchs himself. Nothing about him. It was just this file that therefore got overlooked. There were hundreds of pages, and they unlocked his early life and the drama of it. These documents and others capture historically obscure moments in the 1930s and 40s, and they give a greater nuanced account of Fuchs's life, as well as an appreciation of an unraveling world that surrounded him. His story takes us in a different path, but somewhat familiar place. Swept into his story are internal national struggles, conflicts over immigration and race, establishment of internment camps, dysfunctional legislatures, street protests, paramilitary troops, Russian spying, and of course, nuclear weapons. I covered these subjects extensively in my book, Atomic Spy, and I will touch on a few now. Keep in mind, this isn't a spy story. It is the story of a spy. Klaus Fuchs was born on December 29, 1911, in a little town south of Frankfurt, just south. He was the third of four children whose early years were formed by the devastation of World War I and its aftermath, which was the Allies' blockade and the resulting starvation, the Versailles Treaty and onerous conditions, exorbitant inflation, then the Great Depression and unemployment. His father, Emil Fuchs, was a liberal minister in a very conservative Lutheran church. From early on, he championed the welfare of the working class. He sermonized about it to his congregation. He wrote op-eds, letters, articles to the newspaper, always arguing for the rights of the working class and condemning the right-wing militia groups that were exploding in Germany in the 1920s and really poisoning the country. He was a socialist, not a communist. His views and personality profoundly affected Klaus and his three siblings. They all became socialists. Klaus was opposite in temperament to his father, being as reserved as his father was outspoken, but they had the same unbending core. As a teenager, though, Klaus was a non-political scholar, famous for his mathematics in the area, and he won the Weimar Republic's prize for the best student in the area. In 1930, he registered at the University of Leipzig to study mathematics. In the 1930s, the Weimar government was as unstable politically as it was economically. President Hindenburg ruled by executive decree mainly, because the legislature, the Reichstag, was stalemated. Frequent elections failed to create a majority in the legislature, in the Reichstag, largely because the socialists and the communists had a long-standing hatred of each other. In the presidential election of 1932, the conservative Hindenburg ran for a second term. The socialists, rather than running their own candidate, decided to support Hindenburg because they were concerned if they split the vote, another candidate would be elected, and that other candidate was Adolf Hitler. This was a key turning point in Klaus's life. For every day, for 2 years, he and his brother Gerhard had been fighting against the policies of Hindenburg. It started at the University of Leipzig, where Gerhard was a law student when Klaus arrived, and he was also an active member of the Socialist Student Group. And Klaus's first political act was to join the Socialist Group. His physics professor there was Werner Heisenberg, who disappointed a bored Klaus Fuchs when he only covered the basics in physics and not the new ideas in quantum mechanics. After Klaus's first year in Leipzig, he and his brother transferred to the University of Kiel. In the late 1920s, the Nazis connived to gain an early grip on the universities throughout Germany, and Kiel was no exception. When they arrived, they became members of the Socialist Party and saw what was going on and decided to start their own group to counter the Nazis. Gerhard was an outspoken activist, just like his fathers. He was the leader. He was also older and had some experience. Klaus was the political organizer, a novice, very much under the influence of Gerhard. Klaus had only been involved for a year. So initially, the way they fought their struggles was with provocative flyers, this being one, that would sometimes, depending on what was in them, cause riots and heated exchanges. So in Kiel, being unable to support Hindenburg, Klaus and Gerhard turned to the communist candidate. The socialists kicked them out. Communists invited them to come in. They hesitated, especially Klaus, but they both ended up joining. They never looked back. As the country fell apart with mobs in the streets, a shooting here and there, and finally riots with stormtroopers rushing. Klaus's hatred of the Nazis increased, and vice versa, until a secret Nazi student council sentenced him to death. It culminated in early February of 1933, just after Hindenburg had appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor in the end of January, and act that emboldened the Nazis throughout the country and certainly at the University of Kiel. When a riot erupted at the university, stormtroopers rushed in and beat up Klaus. Nazis yelled, "Throw him in the fjord." Police stood by and watched. They did nothing. How Klaus survived the frigid February inlet of the Baltic Sea is a mystery. All he ever said was that he swam out. A few weeks later, he was on the train traveling to Berlin. Coincidentally, it was just a few hours after the Reichstag had burned. When he saw this in the newspaper, he realized that he was in trouble, and he immediately joined the underground of young resistors. The average lifespan on the streets for these young, mostly college students, we're talking 21, 22, 23-year-olds, was 3 months before the Gestapo grabbed them and tortured them. By July of 1933, the Gestapo was closing in on Klaus. Officials in Kiel, where he was the #1 student on their list, wanted him, and they alerted the Berlin Gestapo to find him and get him back to Kiel. He knew this. He knew they were getting close. He fled to Paris and crossed the Channel and ended up at the University of Bristol in September of 1933. He was 21 years old. His university years in Bristol gained him a BA and a PhD in physics. He had to switch from math because they didn't have a concentration in that at Bristol at the time. He was under the mentorship of future Nobel physicist Neville Mott. And while he was there, he published an article on the measurement of electronic conduction in thin film, a seminal work still widely referenced in microelectronics today. In 1937, he received a postdoctoral fellowship with another future Nobelist, Max Born, at the University of Edinburgh. Throughout this period, he was open about his communist ideology, although he kept secret his contact with German communist friends who had also immigrated to London. He worked with them to create propaganda material and ship it to the resistors in Germany. Throughout this time, his family in Berlin was suffering. His brother escaped to Prague with the Gestapo on his heels, literally. And there in Prague, he contracted TB and ended up in a sanatorium very, very ill. His older sister committed suicide. She jumped off a train. His mother had committed suicide a few years earlier. And his younger sister, Crystal, was the only one who was safe because she obtained a visa to the US to study at Swarthmore College. By 1939, 67-year-old Emil Fuchs was left in Berlin alone. He cared for his parentless grandson throughout the war. In September of 1939, World War II started with a phony war. The real one began in the spring of 1940. At this time, the British government worried that refugees, who they knew were mostly Jews, would be a fifth column and aid a German invasion. It ordered many of them to be rounded up and interned. Excusing this absurdity, one cabinet member said, quote, "Once a German, always a German." On September 12th of 1940, Klaus became one of the first of about 30,000 to be rounded up. They were herded into camps such as Hyden, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, with little food, no newspapers or mail, so they knew nothing about what was going on with the war, except that England was in danger. Crammed space and taunts of Nazi POWs who'd been put in with them. On July 3rd, the government shipped the young male refugees, including Klaus, to Canada. As he was about to leave, he wrote a letter to Max Born, his mentor in Edinburgh, that said, quote, "I find it hard to cut away from a country which I have learned to love." The 10-day trip across the Atlantic to Quebec City on the Ettrick was horrific. The internees lived through starvation and bouts of severe vomiting and diarrhea with no access to a bathroom during the night. No one escaped the stench, the filth, and the squalor. It was much worse than that, but I won't go into details. Please read about it. It was unbelievable. Arriving in Quebec, the refugees stood on the deck of the Ettrick in searing sun for 10 hours with little water and no food. And finally, at 7 p.m., were bussed up to the Plains of Abraham and Camp L with its, as you see, barbed wire and armed guards. Cliques formed in Camp L. The leader of the communist group was the charismatic Hans Kahler, who had been a friend of Hemingway's during the Spanish Civil War. Fuchs became his deputy, basically recreating the relationship that he had with his brother in Kiel and Berlin. In Camp L, they finally had good food and plenty of it, but that benefit was offset by hours of boredom, a serious strain on the men there, as the camp commander exclaimed, quote, "Some of the brainiest people in Canada are in this camp." These included such notables as Nobel Prize winner future Max Perils, Herman Bondi and Tommy Gold, who developed the steady state theory of the universe, science journalist Anthony Michaelis, and many more of all professions, wonderful musicians and artists, historians. So to break up their boredom, they set up a university, which was impressive in its depth and scope. It's where Max Born gratefully learned physics from Klaus Fuchs. Other time there was spent on camp politics. Collar and Fuchs skillfully organized a broad refugee committee when the Canadian government decided to split up Camp L to create a kosher camp. Klaus had the influence to manipulate the numbers so that the non-Jewish communists got to go to the kosher camp as well. This group feared the brutality of being in a camp filled with Nazi POWs. The Orthodox Jews were not happy to have them there, but Klaus managed to do this. And 61 of these communists who were not Jewish ended up in kosher. After release from internment, back in England in January of 1941, Fuchs received, shortly after being there, an offer from Rudy Piles to work on the nascent atomic bomb project at the University of Birmingham, specifically on gaseous diffusion. Once there, he socialized with communists from the camps, including Hans Kahler, who was actually a recruiter for the Russian military intelligence. Although Klaus would not have known that probably when he was in the camp, but he certainly did learn it later on. So not surprisingly, in August of 1941, Klaus met up with a Russian agent in London, taking the step into espionage that sealed his fate. Internment alone did not create Klaus Fuchs the spy. It reawakened Klaus Fuchs, the communist and the resistor. It gave him back his voice that he'd had at an earlier time in his life. In December of 1943, Fuchs sailed to New York City with a British scientific team to work on the Manhattan Project. There, they were setting up a diffusion plant in the US, and they knew that the conventional measures of pressure and flow control were inadequate. Fuchs wrote of what he did when he was there. He said, quote, "I developed the theory of the control system for the US diffusion plant, which was further amplified by the research group at Kellex and applied to its operations. Also, I developed the theory of the effect of the remaining pressure and flow fluctuations on the performance of the diffusion plant and advised Kellex on steps that could be taken to minimize losses of performance." End of quote. It was certainly a significant contribution. Meanwhile, he fleetingly met his new handler throughout the city and gave him as much top secret information as he could put his hands on. Then came a transfer to Los Alamos in July of 1944, where under the leadership of Rudy Piles and the boss of all of the director of all the theoretical work, Hans Bethe, Fuchs was responsible for theoretical work on the lenses for the plutonium bomb. This work was one of the keys to the success of the bomb. There were many keys, but this was one of them that needed to be done properly for it to work. As Fuchs wrote, quote, "I developed the theory of the jets observed in non-lens implosions, the elimination of which is necessary in order to make type implosion workable." I directed the work and the theory of the hydrodynamic processes in the initiator for the implosion bomb and worked on other implosion problems. On June 2nd of 1945, Fuchs drove to the gate at Los Alamos and the guards searched his car. He then drove to the outskirts of Santa Fe to meet his handler from New York and gave him the plans for the plutonium bomb. During the car search, these plans had been in his jacket pocket. A month later, the Trinity test at Alamogordo in New Mexico, the plutonium bomb was a success, and then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki, basically 75 years ago. US and UK scientists foresaw an arms race. Thwarted, they urged their governments to share information on the atomic bomb with the Russians and then to institute a strict inspection regimen. Both the US and UK governments eventually said no. So back in England in the summer of 1946, Fuchs was appointed head of the theoretical research at the new top secret nuclear facility there, Harwell, near Oxford. Rationing, including gasoline, was a critical factor that made the life of the scientists that were there revolve around activities at Harwell. And they set up all kinds of things, similar to what they did in the camps, actually, that had been going on. They had theater and all kinds of other things they did, parties. The 15 theoretical physicists in Fuchs's division supported the creation of nuclear reactors that Britain envisioned for its commercial future. At another top secret site, a team of scientists worked to develop a British atomic bomb. Fuchs was the primary theoretical consultant to that project. Initially, when he got back, he didn't spy because there'd been a number of arrests of Russian spies in Canada, the US, and in Britain. But in 1947, he felt safe and he made contact with a Russian handler there. Then another life-changing event occurred. In August of 1949, US and UK codebreakers sitting in Arlington, Virginia, not far from where I live, deciphered some early 1940 Russian messages. And it was a project that was later called Venona. They contained evidence that there was a spy in the Manhattan Project. Within weeks, the FBI and MI5 had figured out that it was probably Klaus. They weren't sure, but they got to him very quickly. Without these messages, it's highly unlikely that Klaus's spying would ever have been uncovered. So a game of cat and mouse arose between Klaus and MI5. They followed his every step where they could. They bugged his office and his home and his telephones in both places. They needed to catch him actually handing over information to somebody because they couldn't use the Venona messages as evidence in court. They didn't want the Russians to know that they had deciphered them, and so they had to find real on the ground at the moment evidence. But Fuchs had stopped spying at that point. Why he stopped spying is a mystery. Before MI5 and the FBI had an inkling of any spy in the project, Fuchs somehow knew that he was vulnerable to being uncovered. How is not clear. When MI5 began tailing him around England in September of 49, he was on the lookout and he quickly spotted them. Basically, in this game, he was the cat, not the mouse. When the surveillance failed, MI5 sent in its top interviewer, Jim Spartan, to get a confession. He couldn't get it, he couldn't trip Fuchs up. But finally, at the end of January 1950, Fuchs confessed of his own volition because he struggled with having betrayed his friends. That was a very heavy burden on him, and in so doing, perhaps subjecting them to suspicion if he didn't confess. They had to look elsewhere. So they would have looked at his friends who were innocent. A month later, on March 1st, he pled guilty in a trial in the Old Bailey that lasted 88 minutes and was a media sensation. Judge gave him the maximum of 14 years for espionage. Fuchs was shocked. He'd been led to believe that if he cooperated, he would get a lighter sentence. He didn't appeal, even though there were irregularities in the interview process, and he could have. He felt that he had committed this crime and he should pay his penalty. For the Americans and the British, there was a somber backdrop throughout this hunt. In August of 1949, the US and the UK discovered that the Russians had successfully tested a plutonium bomb. Fuchs's information had moved up their schedule by 1 to 2 years. No scientists in the US and the UK doubted ever that the Russian scientists would not get a bomb. That was clear. They were very, very good scientists on their own. But Fuchs's information had let it come earlier, and these scientists in both of the US and UK were shocked and stunned. They just didn't think it would happen that quickly. While Fuchs was in prison, he continued to answer MI5's questions, especially about the handlers that he had while he was spying. Although often, by the time he remembered important details, these people had already left, so nobody was arrested who was connected with him initially. Two people he didn't give up were the last person who had been his handler in London and his American contact. He gave a vague description of gold for the benefit of the FBI, which was under tremendous pressure from its director, J. Edgar Hoover, to find a go-between in the US. Behind closed doors, Congress was pressing Hoover with an important question. Why didn't the FBI detect the spying? Hoover blamed MI5, and with reason. Since 1934, MI5's security file on Fuchs had contained information on his communist spy ties in Germany. With every security clearance, and there were probably a half dozen, questions arose, but they dismissed the possibilities of spying. There were no evidence. He was a good citizen. Everybody sung his praises, and his scientific talents were needed in the prosecution of the war. They needed to have new scientific techniques. They never shared this information with the Americans. Instead, they assured the FBI that they had done rigorous security clearances on all British subjects who had passed in stellar fashion. However, at the same time, MI5 told a British official not to reveal Fuchs's communist background to the Americans. Fuchs was in several Victorian-era prisons and always held in high esteem by the other inmates. He listened to their problems, he gave them cigarettes, and he began courses in math and physics and other sciences. Here's one on evolution that he talked to them about when he was talking about tools that were used, and these were flake tools and how they were made. Some inmates thanked him later because with the information he gave them, they were able to get jobs more easily with this training when they were released from prison. He himself was paroled after 9 years for good behavior. The British tried to persuade him to stay. They actually wanted him to come back and work for them. He refused. He climbed aboard a Polish airliner at Heathrow Airport on June 23rd of 1959. He went back to the GDR. He landed in East Berlin with no hero's welcome. His nephew, Klaus, whom Emil had raised, met him along with another official at the airport in East Berlin. Of course, there were hordes of journalists there, as there had been in London, but a limousine driven by a Stasi agent, it turned out they didn't realize this, whisked them away to Emil's summer cottage. By September of that year, Klaus was the deputy director of the nuclear research facility in Dresden. He had a nice apartment in the city and a weekend house nearby, and he had married Greta Carlson, a woman he had met in Paris in 1933, and the same government official who had met him at the airport in East Berlin. The Russians wanted him to work on weapons research at Dubna, their nuclear facility. He refused. His dream was to develop breeder reactors to power the East German economy. He had had the same dream when he had worked at Harwell. He wanted to help the British do that. And he kept it alive all those years in prison. The East German government made him promises to that effect, and then they abandoned him and the research, and he was devastated. It's probably he never got over it. It was just a stunning blow for him. It ended basically his science. In later years, Klaus, the man who had been key in creating bombs for 3 countries, called for nuclear disarmament. Perhaps he had always been a peacenik. After all, his father became a Quaker at the same time he was a Lutheran minister. Klaus's short-term goals had been to help create a bomb ahead of the Nazis, and then to protect Russia from capitalist and imperialist nuclear blackmail from the West. He maintained that he wanted to create a balance of power and obviate the bomb's further use. Klaus Fuchs died in January of 1988, age 76, of lung cancer. He had been a chain smoker much of his life, and he had asthma besides. He was buried in the Berlin cemetery for noted communists and had a formal funeral with processions and string quartets and all kinds of ceremony. The Russians had never admitted that he helped them. On this occasion, for the first time, they did acknowledge him. They sent a lovely wreath, along with a government official, a young KGB agent from Dresden named Vladimir Putin. What about the significance of Fuchs's spying from a military perspective? The Russians' advance in schedule meant that they had an atomic bomb when the Korean War started. There were many factors involved in Truman's decision not to drop the bomb, which most people consider a benefit. And the Russians having one certainly played a part in this decision. Scholars still debate how much of a part it was at that time. The political downside, though, is indisputable. Anglo-American nuclear cooperation ceased. American citizens succumbed to the Red Scare hysteria whipped up by Joseph McCarthy. American civil liberties suffered, and the Cold War that was just beginning really heated up. Fuchs, the quiet, serious student of mathematics, faced perils, took life-threatening risks, and made grave choices. So how do we judge him? The question of moral accountability is not new. It is still with us, and as difficult to resolve. Now, we in the US debate the standing of some of the most significant founders of our country. In our own chaotic world, ambiguity prevails. And the various answers that come forth create confusion and division. And at this point, that's where we all stand. If a deeper understanding of these issues, many of which still afflict us, interests you, please read Atomic Spy and tell your friends. Also, go to my website, spythebook.com to watch interesting videos, which I've posted of the times. One of them is just a short clip of Klaus. The others are just of the atmosphere that he was living in. And I thank you for listening. It's been a delight to be with you, and I look forward to answering whatever questions you have. You're welcome to ask whatever you like. It will be fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Greenspan. We will now begin the question and answer period. As a brief reminder, if you have questions for the speaker, please submit them to the Q&A function in Zoom. The chat is reserved for technical difficulties. Right. And thank you again, Dr. Greenspan. The first question is, what led you to focus on Fuchs in the first place?
He was a student of Max Born's, and when I was writing that biography, I knew nothing about him when I started, and I came across him in their letters and diaries. They had a very high opinion of him. He would be over their house all the time having dinner. He was in a quartet that Max, who was a wonderful pianist, was in. Fuchs played the violin actually very poorly, I was told by people who were there at the time, but he did try. He was self-taught. He played scat with them. And so I got this wonderful picture of him as a person involved in the family and very smart, and all of a sudden he was a spy. I went to the archives in London, Kew, to see what else I could find about him to include in Max Born's biography, and there was almost nothing. There were 3 little folders, and one of the folders had a note from someone else saying, throw away all the Fuchs files. So I didn't think there was really much information on him. In the book on Born, I put a little bit that I had from the family, but I couldn't supplement that with much else. And then a friend of mine mentioned doing a biography, and I wasn't so sure there was enough material. I went back to the National Archives in Kew in London, and lo and behold, the MI5 had declassified hundreds of files, not only about Fuchs, but about everybody else that was in his world at that time. So I realized that there was quite a bit of information, and I became much more interested and looked around for a little bit more here and there, was able to tumble across things that no one else had found, and decided I had a project. So that's how it happened. It started with Max Born and my interest in him. I was fortunate enough to know the Born children. There were 3, and they were all friends, and they had been with Klaus at that time in Edinburgh, going to the movies with him and going on walks. And also another postdoc person, Walter Kellerman, who became a friend also, was also in the internment camp with Klaus. So I ended up having quite a bit of interviews with people who knew him, even though he had died in '88. Also, his nephew, Klaus Fuchs was extremely helpful in just telling me the family story and allowing me to see the papers that he had, which were quite abundant. So I ended up having a wonderful archive, MI5, with all of the tapes that they had done of his, his phone conversations in his office. The bugs in his office were all in these files. So sometimes you had them, they were also bugging his friends' files. And so you'd get them, you'd get them double time, because you get them from both directions. And there was a wonderful resource there that made the book much more full of who Fuchs was and what he was really doing at the time. It was very fortunate.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions about other Soviet spies at Los Alamos, Ted Hall and David Greenglass, and whether Fuchs knew them and knew that they were also spying.
Well, that's interesting. And I don't know specifically that he knew them. They were all in Los Alamos. Because he was working on the lenses, he did go to all the meetings of the engineering division that worked on them. And Greenglass was one of those people. I assume that he was not an engineer. He was, but he did do the measurements and some of the tooling, I think, for the lenses. And he could very well have been at those meetings. And if he was there, Fuchs would have known who he was, because Fuchs went to them all. As far as Ted Hall, they were working in the same area. I had some information about who was in which office on which floor and which building. I didn't see Ted Hall mentioned. He didn't go to the main, there were weekly meetings when Oppenheimer would go over what was doing. And I don't think Ted Hall was in those, at this point anyway, that when Fuchs was there. So I don't know if he knew Ted Hall or not, but I wouldn't be surprised, because there weren't that many people working on theoretical physics. So, and they were all kind of combined. And someone else actually in your audience may know specifically, but I do not.
Great, thank you. So what was the effect of Fuchs' arrest on Rudolf Perls? Did it cause trouble for him?
When they thought they had Fuchs, this was, after 2 or 3 weeks of looking, Perls was another possibility that they wrote down. He fit some of the same descriptions that were of the hints that were in these Venona messages. So he was on the list, and they actually bugged his house. They followed him some of the time, not as closely as Klaus, but they were very interested in him. And there's, among these things that were declassified, are all of the phone conversations and other activities of Rudy Perls. So he was under watch just at the same time that Klaus was. Once they had, and there was some question, sometimes they'd say, oh, it wasn't Klaus because something didn't fit well. And then they'd kind of look at Perls, and they realized that it really didn't fit with him from a time perspective of when the spying occurred in the US. But they continued, even after Klaus was convicted, he confessed, he was in prison, they continued following and keeping an eye on Perls for a while. It was very clear he had nothing to do with it and he knew nothing about it, but they just didn't want to let go quite. He could have been another spy. There could have been 2 of them, and they just didn't know. So I think he knew. I mean, he would have known after a while that he was under surveillance, I would think, and it would not have been. It was stressful. And there were even people who just knew him that they knew weren't spies. They were interviewed. They were, someone said it was one of the worst times of their life. And this person had only been involved with Klaus for a couple of months. Frank Kierton was just, they were always, the MI5 was very rigorous in really going after everybody and making sure they had they remembered everything they had to remember. So it was unpleasant for anybody who knew Klaus, and particularly unpleasant, let me put it that way, for Perls, because he was on the short list of who it could have been. But I just want to repeat, he had nothing to do with it, and he knew nothing about what Klaus was doing, even though they were very good friends.
Great, thank you. So was there anything that you found in the archives that you wished could have made it into the book, but that you couldn't include?
Oh, I actually wrote a much longer book, and a lot of it got taken out. There are so many people. There was a number of, Internment had a lot of, it was just a fascinating time. The Internment, and it was only a few months. I wrote two chapters on Internment, and I could have written a whole book, not just about Fuchs' involvement, but about the whole experience, which it was amazing, just because it was so unique to, we had our Japanese Internment, but this was a lot rougher than that. I would have liked, well, one of the things I would have loved to have spent some time on, and actually wish I had more information about, was why he stopped spying in the spring of 1949. I put down a few of the ideas that came to me about why he may have, and it's fascinating how he obviously found out that the Venona project existed. And I would have liked to have written, I guess, more about that and just explored possibilities, but they really were just assumptions or possibilities on my part. And I put in a little bit about that, how he might have found out, this or that. So I guess that would be that's the one thing that I would love to meet him and ask him about if I had that option. How did you know? And I also would have spent a little bit more time on the book on it, but it wasn't going to get me anything. And so I don't know if it's fair to put in too many of my own assumptions. I really did try to stick to what I knew as a fact.
Great, thanks. So are there parallels between Japanese internment in the US and German internment in the UK in terms of reconciliation with the British afterwards?
As far as I know, I think it was I only know about I only followed it for the 8 months that Klaus was in internment, and his friends, and a number of the people that were on the Ettrick. I don't know of anybody getting reparations, any talk of it in England. In fact, most people in England don't even know that there was an internment. This is a lost piece of British history. There are a number of people trying to resurrect it a bit, but everybody, there were no British citizens. It was all refugees. And a lot of the people, left afterwards or didn't want to bring attention to themselves. So there was, I don't think there was ever any talk about making things equal for them when they were out. These particular people who went on the Ettrick, there was 2 other ships as well. And there was another ship that went to Australia, and they really had a horrible life for the months that they were there. The trip to Australia was even worse than the trip on the Ettrick. I mean, I remember reading a story that one of the guards just to let you know what these people went through on the Dunero, which is the name of the ship that went to Australia. The guards broke bottles and things like that and made the internees run around with the glass on the floor in bare feet. It was that kind of thing. It was very sadistic. They didn't do that on the Ettrick, but they most of the time they were starving and living in filth. And in the second camp that they were in was the kosher camp. The guards were extremely anti-Semitic, and it was very difficult. So I don't know that much about, I know what generally people know about Japanese internment. I've never studied it. It was not, they lost everything. And certainly they sometimes lost their houses, their businesses. So did the people who were in the British internment, the refugees. But, and they both had families. If one had a family, sometimes the families the wives and the children ended up on the Isle of Man. Klaus was there as well, but only for a short time. So it depended upon where you were in the British internment. If you were on the Isle of Man with your family, you weren't with your husband. You were if you're a woman, you were with your kids. Your husband, men were separate. It was it wasn't a pleasant experience, and they did lose everything. And it was kind of scary, but they got enough to eat, and they got taken care of. And I think the Japanese internment had a different psychological overlay on it.
Thank you. So now that this book is out, what's your next project going to be?
Well, I don't know. I'm waiting for something to drop in my lap. Both these two, both the book about Max Born and and book about Fuchs, both kind of fell in my lap. They just came to me, and I'm hoping that when we have a vaccine and the virus is over, that something else will come into my lap. Just traveling around and talking to people, things happen, and this is we have not had that experience at this point. So I'm waiting, and if anybody has any ideas of someone they think would be interesting, please email me and let me know. I'm looking. Thank you.
Great. And we still have a couple of more minutes if any last questions want to come in. But in the meantime, thank you again very much, Dr. Greenspan, for a fascinating talk. And let's see, I guess this is it for the Q&A. So we will play the last couple of announcements, and that will be it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. We will conclude with a few words from Joanna Behrman, the Assistant Public Historian at the Center for History of Physics.
Thank you all again for coming to this Trimble lecture with historian and author Nancy Greenspan. This lecture has been recorded and will be made available for viewing on our YouTube channel, AIP History Programs. For updates on future Trimble lectures, you can follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our email list on our website. The next Trimble lecture will be given by Dr. Joseph Martin on Wednesday, December 2nd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. His lecture is titled, When Condensed Matter Physics Became King. We hope that you'll join us then.